That horse has thrown every champion rider who's touched its reins, a voice shouted across the Wyoming fairgrounds. If a man can ride her today, he can name his price. Laughter rolled through the crowd beneath the bright September sun as hundreds of spectators pressed against the wooden fences surrounding the arena. The scent of fresh hay drifted through the air. Country music echoed from distant speakers. Vendors sold lemonade, smoked brisket, and homemade pies while families gathered for the biggest ranch exhibition in Carbon County. In the center of it all stood a massive black mare, restless and proud, her mane dancing in the prairie wind. One rider after another had already stepped away shaking their heads. Some lasted seconds. Others never even made it into the saddle. Near the back of the crowd, Garrett Walker adjusted the worn brim of his hat and held a feed sack over one shoulder. Beside him walked his 10-year-old daughter, Abby, clutching a small paper bag filled with caramel popcorn. "Dad, that horse looks sad," she said quietly. Garrett glanced toward the mare. Most people saw defiance. He saw fear. "Sometimes the strongest creatures carry the deepest worries," he replied. Abby smiled. "Like people?" Garrett nodded. "Especially people." Neither of them planned to stay. They had only come to deliver a custom saddle to a nearby ranch owner before heading home. But then a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the arena entrance. Conversation softened. Heads turned. Claire Montgomery stepped out. Tall, confident, and impossible to ignore, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that moved entire industries. Her fitted ranch jacket and polished boots looked expensive without trying to. Employees hurried behind her carrying folders and tablets. "That's Claire Montgomery," someone whispered. "The CEO. The one who owns Montgomery Holdings," another asked. "Half the ranches in this state answer to her." Claire barely acknowledged the attention. Her eyes remained fixed on the black mare. "Increase the offer," she instructed one of her managers. $50,000. The crowd erupted. More riders volunteered immediately. None succeeded. The mare grew more agitated with each attempt. Dust swirled beneath her hooves. Frustration spread across Claire's face. She hated losing control. She hated unsolved problems even more. Then Abby tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad," she whispered. "She keeps looking at you." Garrett frowned. "Who?" "The horse." For a moment he simply watched. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade. The mare's ears shifted toward him. Her breathing slowed. Something changed. Not in the arena. In the silence between them. Garrett handed Abby the feed sack. "Stay by the fence." Abby's eyes widened. "You're going in there?" Nearby spectators noticed him stepping forward and chuckled immediately. A few exchanged amused looks at the sight of a modest single dad in faded jeans approaching a challenge that had defeated professionals all afternoon. Claire crossed her arms, studying him with growing curiosity. Garrett ignored every stare. He ignored every laugh. He walked straight toward the horse. And before anyone could understand why, the most unpredictable animal in the entire county lowered her head as if she had been waiting for him all along. Before the story takes a turn, subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me, do you think she should trust him? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's continue. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. A moment earlier people had been laughing. Now not a single voice rose above the whisper of Wyoming wind moving across the fairgrounds. Garrett stopped a few feet from the mare and said nothing. He did not reach for the reins. He did not make a show of confidence. He simply stood there with the patience of a man who had spent years learning that trust could never be forced. The black mare studied him. Her muscles remained tense, but her ears stayed forward. Around them, dust drifted lazily through shafts of afternoon sunlight. Somewhere beyond the arena, a train horn echoed across the prairie. Claire Montgomery watched from the fence line, her arms still crossed, though the certainty in her expression had begun to soften. One of her managers leaned closer. "Should security be ready?" he asked quietly. Claire never took her eyes off Garrett. "No," she replied. "Just watch." Garrett took one slow step forward. The mare did not pull away. Another step. Still nothing. Then, with a gentleness that surprised everyone, he lifted his hand and rested it lightly against her neck. The reaction was immediate. The mare released a long breath. Her head lowered slightly. The crowd exchanged confused glances. "How is he doing that?" someone whispered. Abby smiled from behind the fence. She already knew the answer. Her father never tried to control animals. He listened to them. Garrett ran his hand through the mare's dark mane and spoke so softly that only the horse could hear. Whatever words he chose seemed less important than the calm behind them. The mare shifted her weight. The nervous energy that had filled the arena all afternoon slowly faded away. Claire found herself stepping closer. For years she had built companies, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and managed thousands of employees. Yet somehow this quiet rancher was solving in minutes what money and expertise had failed to solve all day. Garrett accepted a saddle from a nearby handler and secured it with practiced movements. No rushing. No tension. The mare remained still. Then he placed one boot in the stirrup and swung himself smoothly into the saddle. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. For several seconds nothing happened. Horse and rider simply sat together beneath the enormous western sky. Then Garrett gently guided her forward. The mare walked. One lap became two. Two became three. Soon they were moving across the arena with effortless grace, as if they had known each other for years. Applause slowly began to spread through the stands. Claire did not join in. She was too fascinated. There was something unusual about the man. He was not showing off. He was not chasing attention. In fact, he looked almost uncomfortable being the center of it. When Garrett finally guided the mare back toward the fence, the applause grew louder. He dismounted, patted the horse affectionately, and prepared to walk away as though the entire moment had been ordinary. That was when Claire stepped directly into his path. Her blue eyes locked onto his. "Mr. Walker," she said calmly. "I think we need to talk." Garrett looked surprised. "About the horse?" Claire allowed herself the faintest smile. "About much more than that." Garrett glanced toward Abby before returning his attention to Claire. The applause was still fading behind them, but he looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. "I appreciate the conversation," he said politely, "but my daughter and I need to get back home before dark." Claire studied him for a moment. Most people rushed toward her when they learned who she was. Most people wanted something. A favor. An opportunity. A photograph. Garrett Walker seemed interested only in leaving. "You turned down $50,000, Claire said. "Most people would not do that." Garrett shrugged. "I never rode her for the money." "Then why?" Claire asked. He looked toward the mare, who now stood peacefully beside the fence. "Because she needed somebody to listen." For reasons Claire could not explain, that answer lingered in her mind. Nearby, executives from Montgomery Holdings exchanged puzzled looks. One quietly reminded Claire about a scheduled meeting. She ignored him. "I own a ranch about 30 miles west of here," she said. "One of the largest breeding operations in the region." Garrett nodded politely. "Congratulations." The response caught her off guard. "Congratulations," she repeated. "That is all you have to say?" Garrett smiled faintly. "You worked hard for it, I assume." Abby covered a giggle. Claire found herself fighting a smile of her own. Very few people spoke to her like a normal human being. Even fewer made her feel slightly unprepared. The late afternoon sun painted the fairgrounds gold as families drifted toward parking lots and food stands. The smell of barbecue floated through the cooling air. Somewhere a country band began playing near the main stage. Claire removed a business card from her jacket pocket and handed it to Garrett. "I would like to hire you." Garrett did not even look at the card. "For what?" "Horse training. Behavioral evaluation. Consultation." "You already have trainers." "None of them did what you did today." Garrett finally accepted the card, more out of courtesy than interest. "I have my own work." Claire stepped closer. "Double your current rate." Garrett shook his head. "No," one of the executives nearly choked on his coffee. Claire blinked. "No. I repair saddles, train a few horses, and raise my daughter. That keeps me busy enough." Abby nodded proudly. "And he makes the best pancakes in Wyoming." Claire laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised everyone, including her. Garrett tipped his hat. "We should go." For several seconds Claire watched him walk away with Abby toward an aging pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. Father and daughter talked about caramel popcorn, school projects, and whether the mare preferred apples or carrots. Their conversation carried the effortless warmth of a family that had survived difficult years without losing kindness. Claire stood silently as they drove away beneath a sky streaked with orange and purple. Most people spent their lives trying to impress her. Garrett Walker had done something far more dangerous. He had made her curious. And for the first time in a very long time, Claire Montgomery found herself wondering when she might see someone again. 3 days passed before Garrett thought about Claire Montgomery again. Life had a way of keeping him focused on simpler things. The roof of his workshop needed repairs before winter. 2 custom saddles were waiting for delivery. Abby had a school science project involving native Wyoming grasses that somehow required more patience than training a horse. The rhythm suited him. Quiet work. Honest effort. Family. That morning the sky stretched clear and blue above the rolling plains as Garrett worked beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree beside his barn. The smell of leather and fresh cut wood filled the air. A radio played soft country music from an open window while Abby sat nearby painting labels for her project. Then a dusty pickup truck appeared at the end of the gravel road. Garrett barely looked up. Visitors were uncommon. The truck stopped, and a woman climbed out wearing faded jeans, work boots, and a simple denim jacket. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail beneath a weathered ranch cap. For a moment Garrett did not recognize her. Neither did Abby. "Morning," the woman called. Garrett set down his tools. "Morning." The woman smiled. "My name is Claire." Abby tilted her head. "The horse lady?" Claire laughed softly. "I guess that is one way to describe me." Garrett folded his arms. "What are you doing here?" "I need help." "You own half the state." "Not with this." Garrett raised an eyebrow. Claire gestured toward the truck. "There is a ranch manager position open on one of my properties. I want to understand why good people keep leaving. So hire a consultant." "I have." "Hire another one." Claire sighed. "That is exactly the kind of answer I am trying to avoid." Abby watched the exchange with growing amusement. Claire looked less like a powerful executive today and more like someone determined not to take no for an answer. The breeze carried the scent of sagebrush across the property. Horses grazed peacefully beyond the fence. For a few moments nobody spoke. Then Claire reached into her truck and pulled out a worn notebook. "I spent the last 3 days reading reports," she said. "Productivity numbers. Employee surveys. Financial statements. None of them explain why your horse trusted you after 10 minutes when my staff could not earn that trust in 3 years. Garrett glanced toward the pasture. People and horses are not all that different. Claire stepped closer. That is exactly why I am here. Abby smiled. You really want him to help, do you? Claire nodded. Very much. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Something about her seemed different from the woman standing in the arena days earlier. The confidence remained, but now there was curiosity too. Humility, even if she was not entirely comfortable with it yet. Finally Garrett exhaled slowly. One visit, he said. I will look around. Relief flashed across Claire's face so quickly she could not hide it. That is all I am asking. Neither of them realized that the simple agreement would become the first step toward changing both of their lives. 2 days later Garrett followed Claire's truck. Through a winding stretch of open country where golden grass rolled across the hills like waves beneath the Wyoming sky. The ranch appeared beyond a rise, sprawling across thousands of acres with white fences, red barns, grazing horses, and distant mountains standing guard along the horizon. Abby pressed her face against the pickup window. It is huge, she whispered. Garrett had to admit she was right. The property looked less like a ranch and more like a small kingdom built from hard work and generations of ambition. As soon as they arrived, employees greeted Claire with careful professionalism. Their smiles were respectful, but Garrett noticed something else. Tension. It lingered beneath every conversation. Workers lowered their voices when supervisors approached. Stable hands avoided eye contact. Nobody seemed completely comfortable. Claire noticed him observing. You see it too, she said quietly. Garrett nodded. People do not leave jobs because of horses. Claire folded her arms. Then why are they leaving? Garrett glanced around the yard. I am still figuring that out. Throughout the afternoon he walked the property while Abby happily followed a ranch hand who showed her newborn foals in one of the barns. Garrett spoke with trainers, maintenance crews, cooks, and ranch workers. He asked simple questions. He listened more than he talked. The answers were polite, but careful. Too careful. By sunset he had learned something important. The problem was not money. The ranch paid well. The problem was distance. Decisions came from offices. People worked in fields. Somewhere in the middle, trust had disappeared. The evening air cooled as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the ranch house porch where Claire sat reviewing reports on a tablet. Garrett stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of coffee from the kitchen. You look like you are preparing for battle, he said. Claire accepted the mug. Every day feels like one lately. Garrett settled into a nearby chair. Crickets sang from the grass below. Horses moved quietly in distant pastures. The ranch seemed peaceful from afar. You built something impressive, Garrett said. Claire stared toward the horizon. My father built most of it. And you? She hesitated. I spent 15 years proving I deserved to keep it. The answer carried more weight than the words themselves. For a few moments only the wind spoke between them. Then Claire surprised herself. Do you ever get tired? She asked. Garrett smiled softly. Every day. I mean truly tired. Garrett looked down at his coffee. After my wife passed away, there were mornings I was not sure how I would make it through the next hour. Claire's expression softened immediately. I am sorry. So was I. He gave a small smile. Then Abby needed breakfast. School rides. Science projects. Life keeps moving. Claire looked away quickly, as though hiding something. My father spent his entire life building this place, she said. But he missed birthdays. Holidays. Family dinners. Sometimes I wonder if success cost more than it was worth. Garrett studied her carefully. For the first time he was not seeing a powerful executive. He was seeing a lonely woman carrying responsibilities too heavy to share. And for the first time in many years, Claire Montgomery felt understood by someone who wanted nothing from her at all. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of silver clouds drifting over the mountains. The ranch was already awake. Trucks moved between barns. Horses grazed beyond the fences. Workers gathered near the main stable carrying feed buckets and tools. Garrett spent the first hour speaking with employees, listening to concerns that rarely appeared in official reports. By noon he had filled an entire notebook with observations. Most of the problems traced back to the same source. Decisions were being made by people who no longer spent time with the people affected by them. As he walked toward the administrative building, he noticed a luxury helicopter descending toward a private landing area beyond the main house. Several black SUVs were already waiting. Men and women in business attire hurried across the property carrying briefcases and folders. Garrett frowned. "That seems excessive for a ranch meeting," he muttered. One of the stable managers looked surprised. "You did not know?" "Know what?" The man hesitated. "The board is arriving today." Garrett felt a small knot form in his stomach. He entered the main building and followed the sound of voices toward a conference room. The large wooden doors stood slightly open. Inside, nearly 20 executives sat around a polished table. At the head of that table sat Claire. Not in jeans. Not in a ranch jacket. She wore a tailored navy business suit. Her posture was confident. Commanding. Every person in the room focused on her words. "The quarterly projections remain strong," she said calmly. "However, employee retention continues to concern me." Garrett stopped walking. For several seconds he simply stared. Claire looked up and immediately saw him standing in the doorway. The color faded slightly from her face. Around the table, conversation stopped. The room fell silent. One executive leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is that?" Claire stood slowly. "Garrett." He looked from her to the executives and back again. Pieces that never seemed important before suddenly connected. The private aircraft. The security teams. The constant phone calls. The endless meetings. "You never told me," he said quietly. Claire stepped forward. "I was going to. You said you needed help understanding the ranch." "I did." "You said you wanted an honest opinion." "I did." Garrett nodded slowly. "But you never mentioned that you own all of this." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The tension hanging in the room felt heavier than any storm cloud outside. Claire approached him carefully. "I wanted you to see the ranch before you saw the title attached to my name." Garrett looked away. "That should have been my choice." For the first time since they met, Claire had no immediate answer. She had negotiated billion-dollar deals. She had handled hostile acquisitions and corporate crises. Yet standing in front of one disappointed rancher felt infinitely harder. Garrett closed his notebook. "I think my work here is finished." "Garrett, please." He shook his head. "You asked for honesty. Here it is. Trust matters." Then he turned and walked away. Through the conference room windows Claire watched him cross the ranch yard beneath the darkening Wyoming sky. And for the first time in years, the woman who controlled thousands of acres of land realized there were some things money, power, and success could not buy back once they were lost. The drive home felt longer than usual. Gray clouds followed Garrett's truck across the open highway while Abby sat quietly beside him, watching the landscape roll past the windows. She rarely stayed silent for long. That alone told him she was thinking. Nearly 20 miles passed before she finally spoke. "Are you mad at Claire?" Garrett kept his eyes on the road. "A little. Because she is rich?" No, Abby considered that answer. Because she did not tell you everything? Garrett nodded. Trust is important. Abby looked out the window again. I think it is important too. The conversation ended there, but her thoughtful expression remained. Back at the workshop, life returned to its familiar rhythm. Saddles needed repairs. Horses needed attention. Bills still arrived in the mailbox. Yet despite his determination to move forward, Claire Montgomery appeared in his thoughts more often than he expected. He remembered her laughter at the fair. The honesty she had shown on the porch. The loneliness hidden behind her confidence. 3 days later, trouble arrived at the ranch. Not the kind announced by storms or broken fences. The kind carried by signatures and boardroom decisions. Claire sat at the head of a conference table as executives reviewed financial projections displayed across a large screen. Derek Lawson, the company's chief operating officer, stood confidently near the front of the room. The Western Division is underperforming, he said. Selling 20,000 acres would increase shareholder value immediately. Claire frowned. That land supports dozens of families. Derek nodded without concern. Families do not appear on quarterly reports. Several board members quietly agreed. Claire felt frustration tightening inside her chest. The ranch represented more than numbers. It represented generations of history, livelihoods, and community. Yet every argument she made seemed to collide with spreadsheets and profit forecasts. By the end of the meeting, pressure from the board had become impossible to ignore. They wanted a decision within 2 weeks. Outside the conference room, ranch employees had already begun hearing rumors. Anxiety spread quickly. Workers worried about layoffs. Families worried about losing homes tied to their jobs. The atmosphere Garrett had noticed during his visit grew even heavier. That evening Claire stood alone near the horse pastures watching the sun disappear beyond the mountains. The black mare from the fair grazed peacefully nearby. For the first time in years Claire felt completely uncertain. Her phone rang. She ignored it. A second call followed. Then a third. Eventually she silenced the device and stared toward the horizon. Hundreds of miles away, Abby sat at the kitchen table finishing homework while Garrett repaired a saddle under a hanging workshop lamp. "Dad?" she asked suddenly. "What? If somebody makes a mistake, does that mean they are a bad person?" Garrett paused. "Not usually." "Then why do people leave when someone makes a mistake?" Garrett looked at his daughter carefully. Abby lowered her pencil. "You always tell me good people deserve second chances." The workshop fell quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Garrett had no immediate answer. Abby returned to her homework. "I just think people need help sometimes," she said softly. Later that night, after she went to bed, Garrett sat alone on the porch beneath a sky filled with stars. The Wyoming air carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the darkness stood a ranch fighting for its future. And somewhere beyond his pride stood a woman facing that fight alone. The next morning Garrett woke before sunrise. The conversation with Abby still echoed in his mind as he stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee and watching pale light spread across the Wyoming horizon. Some lessons children learned from parents. Others traveled in the opposite direction. By 7 o'clock he had made a decision. 2 hours later his pickup rolled through the gates of the ranch. Employees looked surprised to see him. Word of the board's proposal had spread quickly, and uncertainty hung over the property like a storm cloud that refused to move on. Garrett spent the day doing exactly what he had done before. He listened. Ranch hands spoke about families who had worked the land for decades. Stable managers explained breeding programs built over generations. Local suppliers described how much of the surrounding community depended on the ranch's success. Piece by piece, Garrett gathered something far more valuable than spreadsheets. He gathered stories. Meanwhile, inside the administration building, Claire faced another difficult meeting. Derek Lawson stood confidently before the board presenting charts and financial projections. Selling the western acreage is the logical solution, he repeated. The numbers are clear. Claire remained silent. The numbers were clear. The consequences were clear too. Late that afternoon a board session was called in the main gathering hall overlooking the ranch. Executives filled the front rows. Managers sat behind them. Employees stood along the walls. The atmosphere felt tense and uncertain. Claire stepped toward the podium, prepared to defend her position one final time, when the doors at the back of the room opened. Garrett walked inside. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Claire froze. She had not expected to see him again. Garrett carried a weathered notebook beneath one arm. His expression remained calm, steady, and completely unafraid. Derek frowned immediately. "This is a private meeting." Garrett nodded. "Then I will be brief." Several board members exchanged skeptical looks. Claire said nothing. She simply listened. Garrett opened the notebook and began sharing what he had learned. He spoke about workers who arrived before dawn every day. He spoke about families whose livelihoods depended on the ranch. He spoke about trainers who had devoted years building bloodlines that could not be replaced by quick profits. He spoke about local businesses supported by the ranch economy. No dramatic speeches. No anger. Just truth. One story after another. One name after another. Slowly the room changed. Executives who had spent hours discussing acreage and revenue began hearing about people. Real people. The silence grew deeper with every page Garrett turned. When he finally finished, he closed the notebook and looked directly at the board. "You own land," he said quietly. "But these people built a community." Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Even Derek seemed unable to find an immediate response. Claire felt emotion tightening in her chest. For the first time since the crisis began, she was not standing alone. Garrett had not returned because of money. He had not returned because of pride. He had returned because he believed some things were worth protecting. And in that moment, Claire realized she was no longer looking at a consultant, a rancher, or even a friend. She was looking at the man who had quietly reminded everyone in the room what truly mattered. The decision came 3 days later. The board voted against selling the western acreage. Derek Lawson's proposal was rejected, and for the first time in months the ranch breathed easier. Relief spread through the employees like sunlight after a long storm. Families who had spent sleepless nights worrying about their future gathered at local diners and church halls sharing cautious smiles and grateful conversations. Yet for Claire, the victory felt incomplete. The crisis had passed, but one question remained. Late October arrived with cool mornings and golden cottonwood trees lining the ranch roads. The annual Fall Heritage Festival brought hundreds of visitors from across the county. Children laughed through corn mazes. Horses paraded through the fairgrounds. Local musicians filled the air with country songs while food vendors served barbecue, apple pie, and fresh cider. The ranch felt alive again. Garrett had no plans to attend. He preferred quieter weekends. But Abby had different ideas. "You promised," she reminded him while climbing into the truck. "There will be horses, music, and pie." Garrett smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like a trap." Abby grinned. "A delicious trap." By late afternoon they arrived at the festival. Employees greeted Garrett warmly. Several thanked him for speaking at the board meeting. He accepted every word with the same humility that had carried him through life. As the sun began lowering toward the mountains, an announcement echoed across the festival grounds. "Everyone please gather near the main stage." Curious conversations filled the air as people moved toward the large wooden platform overlooking the pasture. Claire stood waiting at the center of the stage. The crowd gradually fell silent. Garrett stopped near the back, hands in his pockets, uncertain why he suddenly felt nervous. Claire stepped forward. "This ranch exists because of people," she began. "Not buildings. Not land. Not balance sheets. People." Applause followed. She continued. "A few weeks ago someone reminded me of that truth when I needed it most." Her eyes found Garrett in the crowd. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He simply chose to help. Garrett immediately looked uncomfortable. Abby looked delighted. Claire motioned for him to come forward. After several seconds and a gentle nudge from his daughter, he finally walked toward the stage. The crowd welcomed him with warm applause. Claire handed him a small wooden box. Confused, Garrett opened it. Inside rested a beautifully crafted brass key. Murmurs spread through the audience. Claire smiled. "This key represents permanent stewardship of the South Pasture Training Grounds." Garrett blinked. "Claire," she raised a hand gently. "It is not ownership. It is responsibility. A place for your work. A place for future generations. A place that belongs to someone who understands trust." Garrett looked at the key, then back at her. "I cannot accept something like this." Claire's smile softened. "I know." The crowd laughed quietly. Garrett closed the box and handed it back. "I never came here for land." For a moment neither of them spoke. The evening breeze moved through the grass. The mountains glowed beneath the fading sunset. Then Claire answered with a voice barely above a whisper. "I know that too." At that exact moment Abby appeared leading the black mare from the fairgrounds. Around the horse's neck hung a simple wooden sign painted by hand. Garrett read the words and froze. "Welcome home, Dad." Silence settled across the ranch. Not awkward silence. Not surprised silence. The kind that arrives when every heart in a place understands the meaning of a moment. Abby slipped her hand into his. Claire stepped beside him. The mountains stood quiet beyond the horizon while golden light washed across the pasture. And surrounded by the people whose lives he had helped protect, Garrett Walker realized that the greatest things in life were never won through money, power, or status. They were earned through dignity, kindness, second chances, and the courage to trust again. Thanks for spending your time with us today. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe and support the channel. And I'm curious, how old are you, and did this story feel relatable to you? Let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.